biggest land restoration project in Africa didn't use a single bulldozer, a single crane, or a single truckload of concrete. It used shovels, tree stumps already sitting in the ground, and a few million farmers who decided, more or less on their own, that a piece of desert wasn't beyond saving. It's called farmer-managed natural regeneration, and across Niger, in a slow, quiet, mostly unfilmed way, it has turned roughly 6 million hectares of dead land back into something that grows food. That's an area larger than the entire country of Sri Lanka, and larger than most of the megaprojects this channel has ever covered, combined. And almost none of it was built in the way we normally use that word on this channel. It grew back. This is Titan Build. And this is the story of the largest regreening project on the planet, done almost entirely by hand, without a master plan, without a construction budget anyone could point to, and without a single ribbon cutting ceremony to mark the day it started working. Because there wasn't a single day. There were millions of small ones. The tool that made all of it possible was a machine. It was a knife and a shovel, and the patience to use both for decades. To understand how a country accidentally built the largest reforestation project on Earth without really building anything, you have to go back to the disaster that made it necessary in the first place. Between 1968 and 1985, the Sahel, the long, dry belt of Africa that runs just south of the Sahara, from the Atlantic coast in the west to the Red Sea in the east, went through the worst drought of the 20th century. Rainfall that had been unreliable for generations collapsed almost entirely for years at a stretch. Rivers that farmers had built their lives around simply stopped rising in the wet season. Wells that had supplied villages for 100 years ran dry and stayed dry. The human cost was staggering even by the standards of famine history. Roughly 100,000 people died directly from the drought and the hunger it caused. Hundreds of thousands more survived only because of emergency food aid, year after year. An entire region kept alive by grain, sacks stamped with the names of foreign governments thousands of kilometers away. Something like 50 million people across the wider Sahel felt some direct version of that crisis in their own household. A herd that collapsed, a harvest that failed twice in a row, a son or daughter who walked to the city looking for work and simply never had the money to come home. In Niger specifically, the drought exposed a slower, quieter catastrophe that had already been building for decades. Before the rains failed, the land itself was dying, independent of the weather. Trees that had stood in village fields for generations, providing shade, firewood, and windbreaks, were being cut down for fuel faster than anything replaced them. As population grew and farmland became scarcer, cultivation pushed further into marginal, fragile soil that had never been meant to be plowed year after year. Herds of cattle and goats, driven onto smaller and smaller patches of remaining pasture, stripped what little vegetation was left down to the roots. At the worst point of the crisis, researchers estimate the desert was effectively swallowing something on the order of 20 million hectares of previously usable land across the region. Every single year, topsoil that had taken centuries to build up, layer by layer, blew away in the space of a single dust storm. Fields that had fed families for generations turned, almost literally, into a crust, hard, cracked, the color and texture of old concrete. When rain finally did fall on land like that, it didn't soak in and feed anything. It hit the hardened surface, cooled for a moment, and ran off uselessly, carrying away what little loose soil remained with it. Governments and aid agencies responded with the solution that seemed most obvious from the outside: plant new trees. Over the following years, millions of saplings were trucked into the region, distributed to villages, and pushed into the parched ground, often as the centerpiece of large, well-funded reforestation programs. Almost all of them died. Some were killed by the heat before their root systems had a chance to establish. Some were eaten by goats within days of planting. The ones that survived both of those threats were frequently pulled up again anyway. not out of carelessness, but because a struggling family with no firewood and a sapling standing in a field made an entirely rational, if short-sighted, choice. This was the landscape, both physically and institutionally, that an Australian agronomist named Tony Rinaudo found himself working in when he arrived in Niger in the early 1980s. He wasn't a tourist or a passing consultant. He had committed years of his life working for a Christian aid and development organization to exactly the project that kept failing: getting trees back into the ground across some of the most degraded farmland in the world. By 1983, Rinaudo had been at it long enough to watch his own results discourage him. Nursery after nursery, distribution after distribution, and the survival numbers barely moved.
Appears to be seizing
Local
up.
farmers, understandably skeptical
We need to check the
of yet another
levels.
foreigner with a truckload of seedlings and a plan that didn't seem to be working, had given him a nickname that made clear what they thought of the whole effort. By his own later account, he was close to writing off years of work as a failure and going home. Then, driving down a dirt road between villages, his car got a flat tire. While he waited at the roadside for the tire to be changed, he found himself looking down at a small, scrubby, half-dead-looking bush growing out of otherwise bare ground a few feet away. Something about it made him look twice. It wasn't a bush at all. It was the resprouting stump of a tree that had been cut down years earlier, and the root system underneath it, invisible from the surface, was still alive, still drawing on whatever moisture it could find, still quietly trying to grow back on its own, season after season, with no help from anyone. That single realization reframed the entire problem in his head. The desert around him wasn't actually empty of trees, the way it looked from a moving vehicle. It was full of them. A hidden forest sitting just a few centimeters under the surface of what everyone, including Rinaudo himself, had been treating as dead ground. So he stopped planting new trees, and he started resurrecting the ones that were already there. The technique that grew out of that shift, now known formally as farmer-managed natural regeneration, is disarmingly simple, almost to the point of sounding too easy to be true. A farmer walks his field and identifies stumps or root systems still alive underground. The remnants of trees cut down at some point in the past, whose roots never actually died. Left alone, those roots will send up a cluster of new shoots on their own. The farmer selects the strongest few of those shoots and prunes away the weaker ones with a simple hand knife, the same way you might thin overcrowded seedlings in a vegetable garden. The chosen shoots are then protected, fenced off from goats where possible, simply watched over where it isn't, until they're established enough to survive on their own. That's the entire method. No nursery infrastructure, no irrigation network, no ongoing cost after the first season, beyond the labor of walking the field and making the right cuts at the right time. And because the root system doing the actual work underground is often decades old already, wired into whatever water table exists at that depth, adapted over a lifetime to the specific soil and rainfall of that exact plot of land, a prune stump can turn into a genuinely useful shade-giving tree in as little as 3 to 5 years. A seedling planted from scratch, fighting the same heat and drought with none of that inherited advantage, frequently takes far longer to reach the same point, if it survives at all. The farmer isn't growing a forest from nothing. He's simply choosing, for the first time in years, not to kill the one that was already trying to grow beneath his feet. Not every field had that option, though. In places where the land had been degraded so completely that even the old root systems were gone entirely, where the surface had baked into a hard, sealed crust that nothing could break through on its own, farmers turned to something older than Rinaudo's discovery, a technique with roots stretching back generations before any of this crisis began. Small pits, dug by hand with a simple shovel, spaced out in careful rows across an otherwise barren field. Farmers call them Zai Pits or Half-Moons, depending on the region and the exact shape used. A handful of manure goes into the bottom of each pit before the rains arrive. That detail matters more than it sounds like it should. The manure draws termites, and termites, tunneling through the packed earth in search of it, physically break up the crust from underneath, opening channels that let rainwater soak downward, instead of running uselessly across the surface, the way it had for years. Each finished pit becomes a small, isolated pocket of soft, moisture-retaining ground, just large enough to give a single seed a fighting chance to survive its first, most brutal weeks of growth, in soil that would otherwise offer it nothing at all. It is worth being honest about how unglamorous this actually is as physical labor. A family might spend the better part of an entire dry season before the first rains arrive, digging hundreds of these pits across a single field, entirely by hand, in daytime heat that regularly climbs past 40 degrees Celsius by mid-morning.
We'll finish this row.
There is no machine coming to help.
Dig deep.
There never was one.
Fast.
A very similar technique was independently revived around the same period, just across the border in Burkina Faso, most famously by a farmer named Yakuba Sawadogo, who spent years quietly expanding and modifying traditional Zai pits on land his own neighbors considered worthless, eventually turning barren ground into what locals started calling half-jokingly his forest. The idea that patient, unglamorous, individual manual labor could outperform a funded government program wasn't unique to Niger. It kept showing up independently, wherever farmers were desperate and stubborn enough to try it. None of this needed a government program, a foreign NGO's marketing budget, or a single official announcement to spread from farm to farm. One farmer tried it, on a field everyone around him had already quietly written off as a lost cause. A single growing season later, his millet stood taller, his soil looked visibly darker and less cracked, and his harvest came in heavier than his neighbors. On the exact same rainfall, the exact same dust, under the exact same unforgiving sky. That was the entire argument, and it needed no translation. No pamphlet from an aid agency convinced the farmer standing on the next plot of land. A better harvest sitting in plain view, right across the boundary line between two fields, did that on its own. The neighbor copied him the following year. That neighbor's neighbor copied him after that. Within a handful of years, entire villages were practicing the technique without a single outside program ever formally introducing it to them. Local radio helped carry the idea further and faster than word of mouth alone ever could. Farmer explaining it to farmer in local languages that official government pamphlets had rarely bothered to use in the first place. Women, who in most of these households did the overwhelming majority of the daily walking, required to collect firewood and animal fodder, had perhaps the single clearest incentive of anyone in the community to want trees standing closer to home, and they became some of the technique's most consistent advocates and practitioners in the years that followed. The idea spread the way genuinely useful information tends to spread in a community, with no other means of verifying claims from outsiders, because it was demonstrably true, and because every single person could walk over and check the results with their own eyes. There was, however, one significant obstacle, baked directly into the legal structure of the country, and it very nearly strangled the whole movement before it had a chance to take hold. Under forestry law inherited from the French colonial administration, and left largely unchanged after independence, trees standing on a farmer's land were technically classified as state property, not the farmer's own. Cutting one down, or even pruning one, which is precisely the action at the heart of farmer-managed natural regeneration, without an official permit could, in principle, result in a fine from a forestry official. The perverse, entirely rational result of that law was that for years, the safest thing an individual farmer could do, the moment a young tree started reasserting itself on his land, was to cut it straight back down before any official noticed it, and either claimed it or taxed it. The law, meant to protect Niger's remaining trees, was, in practice, actively incentivizing farmers to destroy exactly the regrowth the country desperately needed. It took years of quiet, largely undocumented pressure from farmers themselves, alongside gradual reform at the local and national level, before that finally changed in any meaningful way. Before the trees standing on a family's own land were genuinely, legally recognized as belonging to that family, rather than to a distant state forestry department. The moment that shift took hold, protecting a stump instead of destroying it stopped being a legal liability and became, in the most literal sense available to a subsistence farmer, free money growing directly out of the ground. It's worth pausing here to compare what this actually cost against what the alternative, more conventional approach to fighting desertification has cost elsewhere in the world. Because the contrast is where this story becomes less a pleasant anecdote and more a genuine indictment of how large-scale environmental engineering usually gets done. China, facing its own version of this exact problem along the southern edge of the Gobi Desert, chose the opposite approach entirely, starting in the late 1970s. The 3 North Shelterbelt Program, sometimes nicknamed China's own Great Green Wall, poured an estimated $23 billion of central government investment into planting tens of billions of trees across 13 provinces in a deliberate, top-down, engineered attempt to hold the desert back by brute force. The early results were not good. Vast stretches of the program relied on fast-growing, non-native poplar planted in dense, single-species blocks, because monoculture plantations are simpler to manage and faster to show visible results to government auditors. In many of the dry zones, survival rates for those plantings fell below 30%. In some shelter belts, survival was closer to 15%. A single pest outbreak in the year 2000 wiped out, roughly, 1 billion planted poplar trees in Ningxia alone, in what amounted to weeks, precisely because a monoculture forest has no genetic diversity to slow a disease or an insect once it takes hold. A study published in 2023, using decades of remote sensing data, found that only around 10% of the trees planted on sandy land in some of those regions more than 40 years ago are still alive today. $23 billion, a fraction of it still standing. Compare that to Niger, where 6 million hectares came back using a knife, a shovel, farmer labor that was never on any government payroll, and root systems that were already, by definition, the exact species proven to survive in that exact soil under that exact rainfall, because they'd already been doing it for decades, before anyone cut them down in the first place. There was no monoculture risk, because every farmer was working with whatever species happened to already be rooted on his own land. There was no dependence on an irrigation network that could fail or a funding stream that could dry up, because the entire system's only ongoing cost was the labor of the people who directly benefited from it succeeding. For a long time, almost nobody outside the immediate region even realized the scale of what was happening. Early satellite imagery of the Sahel simply wasn't detailed enough to distinguish scattered regrowth from bare ground at that resolution. And there was no single agency responsible for tracking informal, farmer-led land change the way there is for a government construction project. It took a geographer named Gray Tapan, working for the United States Geological Survey, to actually document the transformation properly. By painstakingly comparing decades-old aerial photographs of specific villages against new high-resolution satellite images of the exact same coordinates. One frequently cited comparison of the area around the village of Galma in Niger lines up a photograph from 1975 against an image of the same fields from 2003. The difference is immediately, unmistakably visible. A landscape that had been essentially bare in the first photo is dense with scattered tree cover in the second, despite decades of failed, formal, funded attempts to achieve exactly that result through conventional planting. The scale of the numbers, once people finally started measuring properly, turned out to be enormous. 6 million hectares of regenerated land, more than 200 million individual trees that have grown back across just the regions of Maradi and Zinder. Not planted from a nursery, but regrown. From root systems that aid agencies, government foresters, and honestly Tony Rinaudo himself had all originally assumed were already dead. Something like 2.5 million people now farm land that came back through this process in one form or another. Crop yields on regenerated land have, on average, roughly doubled compared to equivalent unregenerated plots nearby. For a family living close to the edge of subsistence every single year, that number isn't an abstract statistic to admire from a distance. It is the specific, concrete difference between running out of stored grain 2 full months before the next harvest comes in, and not running out at all. It's the difference between a surplus that can actually be sold at market for cash, and a harvest that gets eaten down to nothing, well before the new planting season even begins. The benefits compound in ways that go well beyond the crop yield figure itself. Fallen leaves from the regenerated trees feed organic matter back into soil that had been stripped of nearly all of it. Root systems hold the loosened topsoil in place when seasonal winds pick up, instead of letting it blow away the way it had for decades. Branches and canopy break the force of the dust storms that used to bury an entire season's planted crop overnight in a matter of hours. Families who once had to walk for hours in each direction simply to find firewood now what they need from the edge of their own regenerated fields. Livestock that used to starve or die outright during the driest months now have access to shade and fodder within easy walking distance of the home compound, rather than requiring herders to travel dangerously far in search of anything green. But this is not, in the end, a tidy story with a clean, permanent resolution, and it would be dishonest to present it as one. In recent years, armed conflict has spread steadily across large parts of the Sahel, and some of the exact regions where this regreening movement first took root, decades ago, now sit directly inside zones of active insecurity. Farmers have been driven off land they personally spent decades protecting, pruning, and nursing back from bare stumps. Trees that survived 40 years of drought, pests, and hard labor have, in some documented cases, been abandoned overnight or cut down again out of sheer desperation. Not by strangers, but by displaced families with no remaining way to cook a meal or stay warm through the coming season. Aid workers and the agricultural extension staff, who once helped train new farmers in the technique, can no longer safely travel to some of the very villages that pioneered it in the first place. The underlying drivers of that instability are genuinely complicated, and no single cause explains all of it. But researchers and security analysts studying the region consistently point to the same underlying tension. As usable land becomes scarcer under continued population growth and periodic climate shocks, competition between farming communities and pastoralist herding communities over a same shrinking resource base has become sharper and, in places, violent. Armed groups, some with explicitly extremist ideologies, and some simply exploiting weak state presence in remote rural areas, have found fertile recruiting ground precisely in the communities where governance and opportunity are thinnest,
trees,
which are often the same communities that fought hardest, for decades, to bring their own land back to life. The same instability now emptying entire villages across parts of the region is, quite literally, undoing 40 years of accumulated tree by tree progress in a matter of a few violent seasons. A forest that took 4 decades to wake back up can be stripped bare again in a single bad year, the moment there's no longer anyone left in a position to protect it. Even against that backdrop, the underlying method itself has clearly outgrown Niger's borders. Versions of farmer-managed natural regeneration are now a core, if largely unofficial, part of Africa's much larger Great Green Wall Initiative, a continental effort spanning more than 20 countries,
8,000
attempting to hold the southern edge of the Sahara in check along a front roughly 8,000 kilometers long, stretching from Senegal on the Atlantic coast, in the west all the way to Djibouti on the Red Sea in the east. It's worth being clear about what that initiative has actually become in practice, because the original vision and the current reality have diverged significantly. When it was first proposed in the early 2000s, the Great Green Wall was conceived, more or less literally, as a continuous physical line of newly planted trees stretching across the entire continent. Essentially an African version of exactly the top-down, engineered approach that struggled so badly in China. In practice, huge sections of that original tree planting plan have underperformed for precisely the same reasons the 3 North Shelter Belt did. Imported seedlings poorly matched to local conditions, insufficient follow-up maintenance, funding that dried up long before the trees were established enough to survive without it. What has actually been spreading, filling in the gaps of that failed master plan field by field rather than mile marker by mile marker, is this: farmers pruning what's already alive underground, digging water, harvesting pits by hand, refusing to treat degraded ground as permanently lost. Not concrete, not steel, not a single continuous line on a map that a minister could point to at a ribbon-cutting ceremony. Just the same idea Tony Rinaudo stumbled onto by the side of a dirt road, waiting for a flat tire to be changed. Don't try to fight the desert head on with imported material and borrowed engineering. Find what's still quietly alive underneath it, and get out of its way. Step back far enough, and this becomes a genuinely strange kind of megaproject to sit alongside everything else on this channel. No cranes swinging steel into place. No concrete poured by the thousands of tons. No single, dramatic moment of completion that a camera crew could have flown in to film. 6 million hectares of dead land came back to life because a few million individual people, on a few million individual mornings, one field and one pit and one prune stump at a time, made the small, unglamorous, unrecorded decision that a stump was worth saving, rather than burning for firewood that night. It may genuinely be the only project this entire channel has ever covered that got bigger specifically by building less. Every other structure we've told the story of on Titan Build starts with a blueprint, a budget line, and a construction timeline, and ends with something enormous standing where nothing stood before. This one started with a landscape everyone, including the man who eventually solved it, had already quietly given up on, and ended with millions of hectares of forest that nobody, technically, ever planted at all. The forest, it turns out, was never actually gone. It was only ever waiting for someone to stop cutting it down long enough to let it stand back up.
A forest.
Titan Build finds the builds most people never hear about. Subscribe if you want the next one. And here's the question I genuinely can't shake after digging into this one. If the fix for one of the worst desertification crises of the 20th century was already sitting quietly underground the entire time, waiting, while governments spent billions of dollars and decades of effort looking everywhere except down, what else are we tearing out or giving up on right now that we should really just be leaving alone long enough to grow back?